My son thinks he just secured his future by draining $9,200,000 from my life savings. He is probably popping champagne right now, believing he outsmarted a helpless old woman. I sit alone in the dark and smile. He has no idea that every cent he took was marked. That money was never a fortune to inherit. It was a federal prison sentence I wrapped in a bow just for him. My name is Lorraine Whitfield. I am 62 years old. And as I sit in the stillness of my modest living room in Sarasota, Florida, the only sound is the hum of the air conditioning fighting the humid night. The phone in my hand feels warm, a stark contrast to the ice running through my veins. The voice on the other end belongs to a senior fraud analyst from one of the largest banks in the country. He sounds terrified. I am not. Mrs. Whitfield, the young man says, his professional veneer cracking slightly. I need you to listen very carefully. We have detected a series of emergency wire transfers initiated from your primary savings and investment accounts. The activity began exactly 17 minutes ago. I lean back in my armchair, staring at the dark screen of the television. Go on, I say. My voice is steady. Too steady. The total amount transferred is $9,200,000. He continues, the number hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. The system shows these were authorized using your biometric data and passcodes. They cleared the initial security hurdles because they were flagged as urgent family medical restructuring funds. But the speed, the liquidation of the bond accounts, it triggered a manual override review. $9,200,000. My life's work. 30 years of compliance audits, skipped vacations, and shrewd market moves. All vanished in less than the time it takes to watch a sitcom. Who is the recipient, I ask, though the question is purely procedural. The funds were wired to a series of holding accounts that consolidate into a primary ledger under the name Mark Whitfield. The analyst reads, the IP address for the login traces to a residential address in Charlotte, North Carolina. Mrs. Whitfield. Did you authorize a transfer of your entire net worth to your son tonight? Silence stretches across the line. In that silence, I can picture Mark. I can see him in that overpriced penthouse he rents in the trendy part of Charlotte. I can imagine him popping the cork on a bottle of Dom Perignon, the foam spilling over his hands. He is likely hugging Paige, his wife, telling her that the nightmare is over, that the bad investments and the looming debts are history. He thinks he has won. He thinks he finally outsmarted the old woman who paid for his private schools and his first 3 failed businesses. I do not scream. I do not cry. Instead, a small, cold smile touches my lips. It is a smile that would make the analyst's blood run cold if he could see it through the phone line. Mrs. Whitfield, the analyst asks, panic rising in his tone. Are you there? We can try to claw this back. But no. I interrupt softly. I want you to do something else for me first. Are you recording this line? Yes, ma'am. All calls are good. I say, I want this on the official record. I confirm that I did not authorize these transactions. This is an act of grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft committed against a vulnerable senior citizen. Please transfer this case immediately to your specialized fraud investigation unit and, if the threshold is met, contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The analyst gasps. He was expecting a confused grandmother, not a prosecutor. We will escalate this immediately. I hang up the phone and set it gently on the coffee table. 500 miles away, Mark is probably laughing right now. He is clinking glasses with his so-called investment partners, the sharks who smelled his desperation months ago. He believes he has just secured his legacy. He believes the money is real. He thinks tonight is the night he becomes a millionaire. I say to the empty room, my voice dripping with a venom I have held back for years. He has no idea that from the moment his finger touched that enter key, his life became the property of the federal court system. I stand up and walk to the hallway, pushing aside the large oil painting of the Gulf Coast. Behind it sits a wall, safe. My fingers move automatically over the dial, right to 10, left to 35, right to 7. The heavy steel door swings open with a satisfying click. Inside, there are no jewels or stacks of cash, just a single, thick manila envelope. I pull it out and lay the contents on the dining table. The paperwork is meticulous. There is the color copy of the power of attorney Mark forged 3 months ago. There are the printouts of the emails he sent to his creditors promising funds he did not have. There are screenshots of his text messages to Paige, mocking my hesitation to invest in his shell companies. And on top of the pile rests a single sheet of paper with the Department of Justice letterhead, signed by a special agent in the Financial Crimes Division. The ink is barely dry on the trap I set. I look up, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, addressing the son who is no longer mine. You want to know why I am smiling when my own flesh and blood just stole $9,200,000 from me? I whisper, my reflection staring back with eyes that have seen too much. You have to start from the beginning. You have to go back to the day I finally realized that he no longer looked at me and saw a mother, but just a walking safe. I am Lorraine Whitfield, and for 30 years, I was the woman you did not want to see walking toward your desk with a clipboard. I served as the head of compliance and anti-money laundering at Havenstone Regulatory Solutions, a job that required the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a stone. People look at me now, a 62-year-old widow in a floral blouse, and they assume my $9,200,000 came from a lucky lottery ticket or a generous husband. They are wrong. Every cent of that savings was accumulated through decades of staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned, catching the tiny discrepancies that signaled fraud, and investing my bonuses with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to my audits. I did not buy luxury cars. I bought municipal bonds. I did not take European vacations. I compounded interest. But while I was a terror in the boardroom, I was a coward in my own kitchen. My husband packed his bags and walked out on us the week Mark turned 10, leaving a silence in the house that I desperately tried to fill with noise and gifts. I became the classic, overcompensating single mother. I worked 80 hours a week so Mark could attend the best private school in Tampa and spend his summers at equestrian camps that cost more than my first car. I told myself I was giving him the best life possible, but in reality, I was paying a premium to assuage my own guilt. The warning signs were there early on, glowing like neon lights in a dark alley. Mark was brilliant and charming, with a smile that could disarm a traffic cop, but he had an allergy to hard work. I remember when he was 16, he started a business buying used gaming consoles to resell. I was proud until a neighborhood mother called me, screaming that Mark had sold her son a broken unit for $300 and refused a refund. When I confronted him, he didn't look ashamed. He looked bored. "Mom," he had said, shrugging his shoulders. Caveat emptor. Buyer beware. It is just how the market works. I should have made him mow lawns to pay her back. Instead, I wrote the woman a check and told Mark to be more careful. It became our pattern. when he maxed out 3 credit cards in his sophomore year of college trying to keep up with the wealthy fraternity boys. I paid off the balances to save his credit score. When his car was towed for unpaid tickets, I paid the impound fees. I told myself, he is just a boy. He just needs time to mature. I was lying to myself. I was not helping him grow. I was teaching him that consequences were things that happened to other people, never to him. Mark graduated with a business degree and moved north to Charlotte to work in what he called fintech and real estate aggregation. He spoke in a dizzying language of disruption and synergy that I did not fully understand, but I nodded and sent him 5-figure checks for his birthdays, desperate to believe he was the success story I wanted him to be. Then came Paige. She was undeniable beautiful, sharp, and working in digital marketing for a string of startups that seemed to exist only on Instagram. I wanted to love her like a daughter. I really did. But the first time we had dinner, she did not ask about my garden or my volunteer work. Her eyes only lit up when the conversation turned to my assets. Mark tells me you were a legend at Havenstone, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It is rare to see someone from your generation with such a substantial liquid position. You must have incredible access to private equity channels. I brushed it off, but the dynamic shifted. The calls from Mark became frequent and frantic. He would call late at night, his voice tight with stress, talking about angel investors, seed rounds, and bridging the gap. I could hear the desperation leaking through his confident jargon. He was drowning in bad deals, and he was looking for a life raft. The turning point came during a visit 3 months ago. Mark sat across from me at my kitchen table, nursing a bourbon I had saved for special occasions. "Mom," he said, leaning forward. "Paige and I have been talking. You are not getting any younger. We need to look at your estate planning. We need to prepare the paperwork, just in case something happens to you." My blood ran cold. The mother in me wanted to be touched by his concern, but the compliance officer in me heard the alarm bells ringing. He was not asking about my health. He was asking for the keys to the vault. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "I just hate to see your capital sitting there doing nothing," he said. And for a second, the mask of the dutiful son slipped, revealing the desperate gambler underneath. $9 million is a wasted resource if it is not being optimized. We could structure it so I can manage the growth for you. In that moment, the illusion shattered. I looked at my son and realized he did not see me as his mother anymore. To him, I was just an underperforming asset. I was a walking bank account that refused to dispense cash. "I will think about it," I said, forcing a smile. And I did think about it. I thought about it as I watched him drive away, realizing that if I did not protect myself, my son would not just break my heart, he would bankrupt my future. It started with what Mark called a temporary liquidity gap. He came to me with a folder full of glossy architectural renderings for a house in Charlotte, claiming he needed $50,000 to close on the property before a rival developer swooped in. He promised to return the principal plus 10% interest within 60 to 90 days. I wrote the check because I wanted to believe in his ambition, even though the compliance officer in my head was already highlighting the risk factors in red ink. 90 days came and went, but the money did not return. When I asked about the repayment schedule, Mark offered a litany of excuses that sounded like a greatest hits album of every fraudster I had ever investigated. "The permit office is backed up for months," he told me over the phone, his voice smooth and practiced. "My general contractor walked off the job. The market is correcting. It is just a temporary hold." I recognized the script. It was the language of someone buying time with currency they did not possess. Then the strategy shifted. Paige began sending me articles about the rising costs of long-term care facilities. During their next visit, she sat next to me on the sofa, holding my hand with a warmth that felt entirely calculated. "Lorraine," she said, her voice dripping with concern. "Mark and I have been looking into a family trust structure. It puts everything in a shared pool under our management. It is the only way to optimize the tax burden and, well, protect your legacy from being drained by a nursing home if you get sick." I looked at her manicured nails resting on my wrist. I remembered the seminars I used to shut down, where slick salesmen would terrify seniors into handing over their life savings to avoid hypothetical medical bills. "I think I can manage my own future, Paige," I said coldly. But the real blow came a week later. I was visiting them in Charlotte, and Mark had left his laptop open on the kitchen island. I did not mean to snoop, but the screen was glowing with a PowerPoint presentation titled Seed Funding Round B. I tapped the arrow key. On slide 4, under the heading Guaranteed Capital Reserves, was my name. Next to it was the figure $9.2 million. He was pitching me to his investors not as a person, but as a secured asset he had already claimed. I felt sick to my stomach, but I said nothing. I went home and waited. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Beatrice, an old friend from my days at Havenstone. "Lorraine," she said, sounding awkward. "I hate to ask this, but Mark listed you as the guarantor for a $250,000 bridge loan he is trying to secure through my branch. He said you gave verbal confirmation. Is that true?" I closed my eyes, gripping the receiver until my knuckles turned white. He was using my reputation to underwrite his gambling. "No, Beatrice," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shame. "That is not true. Deny the loan. I needed to know how far the rot had spread. I needed to know if there was any part of my son left inside that suit. So I devised a test. When Mark called the next Sunday, I told him a lie. 'Mark,' I said, letting my voice waver. 'The doctor found something irregular in my EKG. He thinks it might be congestive heart failure. I am scared.' There was a pause on the line. A normal son would ask about the symptoms. A normal son would say he was coming home immediately. That is terrible. 'Mom,' Mark said, but the tone was brisk, businesslike. 'Listen, given the uncertainty, don't you think we should accelerate the asset transfer? If, God forbid, you become incapacitated, the state could freeze everything. We need to get those accounts signed over this week.' The silence that followed was the sound of a mother's heart breaking for the final time. 'I am not signing anything.' 'Mark,' I said sharply, dropping the act. 'I have not consulted a lawyer, and I do not understand why you need full control just because I might get sick.' 'You are being selfish,' he shouted, the facade finally cracking. 'I am trying to build something here. You are sitting on a fortune while I am drowning, and you are too paranoid to help your own family.' Paige grabbed the phone, her voice syrupy sweet but edged with steel. 'Lorraine, please. Mark is sacrificing everything for us. This is his last chance to really make it big. Do not be the reason he fails.' I hung up on them. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with the pile of documents Mark had left behind during his last trip, urging me to review them. I spread them out under the harsh light of the chandelier. It was a durable power of attorney, granting Mark Anthony Whitfield unrestricted access to all financial and real estate holdings. I flipped to the last page. My breath hitched in my throat. There, on the signature line, was my name, Lorraine Whitfield. It was written in blue ink. The loop on the L was slightly too wide. The cross on the T was a fraction too high. It was a 90% match. Good enough to fool a tired bank teller, but it was not my hand. I touched the ink, half expecting it to smear. My son had not just lied to me. He had not just used me. He had practiced my signature, studied my hand, and committed a felony to steal the life I had built. I stared at the forgery, and the tears finally stopped. I was no longer a mother grieving a wayward son. I was an investigator looking at Exhibit A. The next morning, I drove to a diner 3 towns over to meet David, an old colleague from Havenstone who now consulted for a major banking conglomerate. I slid the photocopy of the power of attorney across the Formica table, careful to cover the header that identified Mark as the agent. I swallowed my pride, disguising the trembling in my hands as I sipped my black coffee. "It is a forgery." "Lorraine," David said, pushing his glasses up his nose after studying the signature for less than 10 seconds. "And not a particularly good one. The pressure points on the upstroke are all wrong. Whoever signed this was hesitant, probably nervous. If this document were presented to a bank, would it pass?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "With a lazy teller?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But with your compliance flags, it would trigger a review. Why do you ask just consulting on a private matter?" I lied. I could not bring myself to tell him that the nervous hand belonged to the boy I used to rock to sleep. I left the diner and drove straight to the offices of Grayson and Alder, a boutique law firm that specialized in asset protection. I did not want a big firm. I wanted discretion. I sat down with Mr. Grayson and laid out a new plan. We created an irrevocable trust, the kind that is locked tighter than a drum. The beneficiary was not Mark. It was designated for future issue my grandchildren, should they ever exist. "And Mark, Mr. Grayson asked, his pen hovering over the legal pad. "Mark is to be listed as a contingent beneficiary," I said, my voice hard. "But there is a clause. He can only access the funds if he has a clean criminal record for 10 consecutive years and submits to an independent financial audit. If he attempts to contest the trust or access the principal unauthorized, he gets nothing." With the real assets safe, it was time to build the trap. I needed bait. I went to a different bank, one where I still had connections in the back office, and opened what we in the industry call a shadow account. I funded it with a nominal amount, but linked it to a dummy ledger that displayed a balance of $9,221,843. It was a ghost account. To an outsider logging in, it looked like a checking account overflowing with liquid cash ready for transfer. In reality, it was a closed loop monitored by fraud algorithms. I used an old email address for the login, one Mark had seen me use years ago. I set the password to his birthday. It was pathetic how predictable I made it. And yet, I knew it would work. 2 days later. Mark came over for lunch. I staged the scene carefully. I left my laptop open on the kitchen island, the screen glowing with the fake banking dashboard. Next to it, I placed a printed statement with that specific number circled in red ink, $9,221,843. I just don't know what to do with this liquidity. I sighed, stirring a pot of soup while he hovered near the computer. The market is so volatile. I feel like it is just sitting there rotting. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. Mark froze. His gaze locked onto the screen. I saw him mentally calculating. I saw the flash of greed, followed immediately by a wave of relief so profound he almost collapsed. That number wasn't just money to him. It was the exact amount he needed to cover the holes in his Ponzi schemes. "You should really let a professional look at that." "Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Leaving that much cash idle it is irresponsible." "Maybe you are right," I said, feigning a moment of weakness. "I am just so tired of managing it all." The moment he left, I picked up the phone. I did not call the police. I called the internal investigation unit at the bank, hosting the shadow account. I identified myself, gave them my former credentials, and told them exactly what was about to happen. They escalated me to a contact at the Secret Service's Financial Crimes Task Force in Tampa. We met in a nondescript office downtown. The agent, a sharp-eyed man named Miller, listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, your son isn't just a bad investor," Agent Miller said. "The entities he is transacting with, we have been tracking them for months. They are part of a laundering network, moving money for offshore gambling rings. If he moves your money, he leads us to them. So you want me to be the bait?" I stated. "I want you to be a partner," Miller corrected. "But for this to work, we need evidence of intent. We need him to admit he is moving the money without your clear consent, or that he is coercing you. We need you to wear a wire during your next financial discussion." I drove home in silence. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and took off my glasses. I looked at the lines etched around my mouth and the grey in my hair. I saw a 62-year-old woman who lived alone. But as I stared closer, the pity vanished. I was done being the victim. I was done being the mom who fixed things. "You wanted my money." "Mark," I whispered to the reflection, my eyes cold and clear. "You are going to get it. And it is going to cost you everything." The wire taped to my chest felt like a second heartbeat. Cold and hard against my skin, Mark arrived in Sarasota on a Tuesday with a bouquet of lilies and a look of practiced concern that almost made me nauseous. He claimed he drove down because he was worried about a dizzy spell I had mentioned on the phone a week prior. But I knew the real reason for his visit was sitting in the leather briefcase he refused to leave in the car. We went to dinner at a seafood place on the bay. Mark barely touched his grouper. He kept pouring wine and steering the conversation toward the horror stories of the elderly losing everything to the state. "Mum," I spoke to a friend of mine, a top financial advisor, Mark said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He told me that if you have another episode, if you end up in the hospital long term, they can seize your assets, the state, the nursing homes. They will bleed you dry until there is nothing left." I took a sip of iced tea, watching him sweat. "But my insurance covers the hospital, doesn't it?" "It is not about insurance," he snapped, then quickly softened his tone. "It is about control. You need to protect yourself. You need to move the assets into a vehicle where they cannot touch them." Back at the house, the briefcase finally opened. He laid out a stack of documents on the coffee table. It was a revised power of attorney and a new healthcare directive. But buried in the middle was a page granting him unrestricted authority to manage liquidate, transfer, and invest, all distinct and liquid assets. I activated the recorder hidden beneath my blouse. I don't understand all this legal talk. Mark, I said, making my voice tremble slightly. Why does it say liquidate? That sounds like selling. Mark ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. It is just legal jargon. Mum, it means... Look, it means if the market crashes or the government tries to freeze your accounts, I can move the money instantly to save it. Do you trust me? Or do you trust the government? I trust you. Honey, I lied. But I can't read this small print. Let me get my glasses. I shuffled to the kitchen, my movements deliberately slow. In the pantry, I pulled the prepared folder from behind a box of cereal. It contained identical-looking documents, but every single one was a voided copy or had invalid data fields. I swapped the paperwork, took a deep breath, and returned to the living room. My hands are shaking so much today, I said. I will help you, Mark said, eager, guiding the pen to the signature line. I signed the worthless papers. Mark snatched them up the moment the ink was dry, unable to hide the hunger in his eyes. He left an hour later, claiming he had an early meeting in Charlotte, but I knew he was racing to get to a secure internet connection. I did not go to bed. I sat in the study with my laptop, connected to a secure server where Agent Miller and the fraud team were waiting. We watched the login attempt happen at exactly 11:42 that night. My phone rang. It was Mark. "Mom," he said, his voice breathless, manic. "Listen to me. I am seeing some red flags on the main account. I need to move the funds to a temporary holding structure. Do not panic if you get a notification." "Move it?" I asked, clutching the phone. "Move it. Where is it? Is it safe?" "It is safer than the bank," he shouted, losing his patience. "It is going to a family trust ledger in Belize. It is standard procedure for high net worth protection. Just say yes if the bank calls you." Okay. Mark, Belize. That sounds far away. I hung up. On my screen, I watched the numbers drop. The bait account, showing the $9,200,000, was drained in 3 massive tranches. The tracking software showed the money flowing from the shadow account into a shell company in Delaware, then bouncing to a digital wallet, and finally landing in an offshore entity in the Caribbean. Mark thought he was laundering his inheritance. In reality, he was digitally signing his own confession. Every click, every transfer, every routing number was being logged by the Secret Service in real time. 500 miles away. I knew he was celebrating. I imagined him pouring a drink, telling Paige that the old woman was finally out of the way. I sat alone on my floral sofa in the silence of the house. I reached for the thick dossier on the table. The cover was stamped with the Department of Justice seal. I ran my hand over the title typed in bold black letters: Operation Whitfield, Domestic Financial Fraud and Elder Abuse Investigation. Primary target, Mark Anthony Whitfield. "Enjoy it, son," I whispered to the empty room. "It is the most expensive mistake you will ever make." The transfer was barely cold in the digital ledger before the steel gates came crashing down. Within seconds of the funds leaving the shadow account, the bank's algorithm triggered a massive freeze, and a suspicious activity report was automatically fired off to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Miller consisting of 3 words: "We got him." The next morning, I sat in a windowless conference room in the Federal Building in Tampa. Miller projected a complex web of lines and nodes onto the whiteboard. It looked like a map of a viral outbreak. But the virus was my son. The money moved from your Bait account to Blue Ridge Digital Properties in North Carolina, Miller explained, tapping the screen with a laser pointer. From there, it was split into 40 different transactions and converted into cryptocurrency. But here is the interesting part. Mrs. Whitfield, your $9,200,000 was not the only influx of cash hitting those wallets last night. He overlaid another dataset. Dozens of other lines converged on the same digital wallets. Mark did not just steal from you, Miller said, his voice grim. We found 3 lines of credit opened in your name at regional banks in Georgia and South Carolina. He forged your signature to guarantee loans for construction projects that do not exist. It is a classic Ponzi scheme structure. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to look at the other names on the list. Then, the door opened, and I realized these were not just names. 3 other people were led into the room. There was an elderly couple from Asheville holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white, and a widow from Texas who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. They were strangers to me, yet I knew them instantly. They were the people Mark and his friends had charmed, promised high returns to, and then gutted. He told us it was a secure bridge loan. The man from Asheville whispered, his voice shaking. He said his mother was a compliance officer, and she had personally vetted the fund. I closed my eyes. Mark had weaponized my reputation to destroy these people. He was not just a greedy son anymore. He was a predator. He was a cog in a machine that consumed the elderly. We need you to make one more call. Lorraine, Miller said gently. We need to rattle him. We need to know who is pulling the strings above him. I nodded. I picked up the phone and dialed. When Mark answered, I made sure my voice sounded small, frail, and terrified. Mark. The bank called. I stammered into the receiver. They said the account is frozen. They are asking about money laundering. I don't understand what is happening. Shut up. Mum. Mark screamed on the other end. The charm was gone. What did you tell them? Did you mention me? I said I didn't know anything. I cried. But they are saying the police might come. Mark. I am scared. You listen to me. Mark hissed, and his voice dropped to a register I had never heard before. You fix this. You call them back and tell them you authorized every cent. Because if this money stays frozen, Dalton is not going to be happy. And when Dalton is not happy, people get hurt. Who is Dalton? I asked, looking at Miller, who was furiously scribbling the name on a notepad. Do not worry about who he is. Mark snapped. Just know that if you make a big deal out of this, if you drag the cops into this, your reputation, your house, and your freedom are gone. I will have you declared incompetent so fast you will wake up in a state facility before you can sign your name. Do you understand me? My hand tightened around the phone. He was threatening me. My son was threatening to lock me away to protect a criminal named Dalton. I took a breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat. I understand. Mark, I said, my voice suddenly devoid of the trembling act, though he was too panicked to notice the shift. I understand exactly who you are now. I hung up. Miller looked at me with respect. We have the name. Dalton Reeves. He is the head of the Southeast Ring. We have been trying to link him to the Blue Ridge Shell Company for 2 years. Your son just gave us the connection." He slid a document across the table. It was a draft indictment. I looked at the charges stacked like bricks in a wall. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, elder abuse. "We are looking at 20 to 30 years. Lorraine," Miller said softly. "Minimum." I looked at the name, Mark Anthony Whitfield, typed in black ink next to Dalton Reeves and 3 other strangers. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, but my hand did not shake as I pushed the paper back to the agent. "Do what you have to do," I said, staring at the list. He made his choice. Now he can live with it. Mark did not knock. He used the emergency key I kept under the terracotta planter, the one I had put there years ago in case he ever needed to come home for safety. He burst through the front door of my Sarasota home like a SWAT team, his shirt untucked and his eyes wild with a mixture of jet lag and panic. He did not ask how I was. He did not look at the photos of his childhood on the hallway table. He marched straight into the living room and slammed a folder onto the coffee table. "Sign them," he demanded, his voice cracking. "I need you to sign the release forms. The bank says it is just a security flag, but they need the account holder's wet signature to lift the freeze. Do it now, Mom, or the whole deal collapses." I did not move. I stood by the kitchen counter, listening to the drip of the coffee maker. I poured a single cup of black coffee, placed it on a coaster, and then walked over to the dining table where I had arranged my own display. "Sit down, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I don't have time to sit down," he screamed, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Do you have any idea how much money is on the line? If that transfer doesn't clear by morning, I am dead. Literally dead. Sit down," I repeated, pointing to the chair opposite me. Something in my tone made him stop. He slumped into the chair, wiping sweat from his forehead. I slid 3 documents across the polished wood surface toward him. The first was the bank statement showing the frozen funds. The second was the color copy of the power of attorney he had forged. The third was a printed transcript of our phone call from yesterday, with the threats highlighted in yellow marker. Mark picked up the transcript. I watched his eyes scan the lines where he threatened to put me in a state facility. His face went pale, draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. You recorded me," he whispered, looking up with betrayal written all over his face. I was angry. I didn't mean it. "Mom, you know I just say things when I am stressed. You didn't just say things," I said, sitting down across from him. "You did things. You forged my signature. You stole my identity. You tried to empty my life savings into a laundering scheme." "I didn't steal it," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I was borrowing it. It was a bridge loan I was going to pay you back with interest. You just don't understand how business works at this level. Paige pushed me. The partners pushed me. I had no choice." "You always have a choice," I said. "You chose to rob me. You chose to treat your mother like a mark." Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a video call from Paige. He propped it up against the sugar bowl. Paige's face filled the screen, perfectly made up, but with eyes that darted nervously. "Lorraine," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Thank God you are there. Listen, we can fix this. Let's keep this in the family. We can write up a retroactive loan agreement. If you involve the authorities, well, think about the future. Think about your grandchildren. You want to see them one day, don't you? You don't want them visiting their father through a glass wall. I looked at the woman who had helped my son sharpen the knife he stuck in my back. There are no grandchildren. Paige, I said coldly, and there is no fixing this. The Secret Service has been monitoring the accounts for 72 hours. Every transfer you tried to make went straight into a federal evidence locker. Mark made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He slid out of the chair and fell to his knees on my rug, grabbing my hand. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified child who used to run to me when thunder shook the house. "Mom, please, you have to stop them." He wept, his tears soaking my knuckles. "Dalton, he isn't just a businessman. He will hurt me. I owe him too much. I did this to save us. I just wanted to be someone. I just wanted you to be proud." I looked down at him. 10 years ago, those tears would have broken me. I would have written the check. I would have fixed it. But today, I saw the truth. He was not crying because he was sorry for hurting me. He was crying because he was terrified of the consequences. I can't stop it. "Mark," I said, pulling my hand away. "But you can help yourself. Turn yourself in. Cooperate with Agent Miller. Tell them about Dalton. It is the only way you get out of this alive." Mark stood up slowly. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a cold, hard rage. He looked at me, not as a son looks at a mother, but as a predator looks at a trap. "You set me up," he spat, backing away toward the door. "You let me do it. You watched me walk into this. What kind of mother does that? You are a monster. A cold-hearted monster hiding in a cardigan." He swept his arm across the table, sending the coffee cup crashing to the floor. The dark liquid stained the rug, spreading like a bruise. "I am leaving," he snarled. "And you are going to die alone in this house with your precious money." The door slammed shut, shaking the frames on the wall. I stood in the silence of the room, the smell of spilled coffee filling the air. My hands were trembling now, a violent shaking I could no longer control. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Agent Miller. "He is leaving the house," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "He is heading north on the interstate. He knows you are watching. The big fish has taken the hook. Pull him in." I hung up and walked to the large bay window. I could see the taillights of Mark's car fading into the darkness. I caught my reflection in the glass, a lonely figure in an empty house. Did I do this? I asked the silence. Is it my fault? Did I love him too much? Or did I just teach him that love was something he could cash like a check? There was no answer. Just the flashing blue lights appearing silently at the end of the street, waiting to close the final chapter of my son's freedom. The federal search warrant was executed at 9:45 on a Wednesday morning. I did not see it live, but the footage was all over the local news by noon. Agents in windbreakers with FBI stenciled on the back swarmed the Charlotte office of Blue Ridge Digital Properties, carrying out server towers and boxes of files. In the center of the chaos, a camera phone captured my son being led out. Mark was wearing his expensive Italian suit, but his wrists were zip-tied behind his back, and his head hung low to avoid the lenses of his own employees who were live-streaming his ruin. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Paige. "You did this!" She screamed into the receiver, her voice so shrill I had to hold the phone away from my ear. You killed him. Lorraine. You sent the feds to his office and you destroyed our lives. How could you? He is your son. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to her ragged breathing. Paige. Did Mark tell you I don't care what he did? She cut me off, sobbing. We are ruined. The accounts are frozen. The house is going to be seized. Do you have any idea what this does to me? To my reputation, I waited for the question that never came. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask how a mother feels watching her child in handcuffs. She only cared about the collateral damage to her lifestyle. I am hanging up now. Paige, I said quietly, do not call me again unless it is through a lawyer. By Friday, the legal machinery had ground into gear. I spent the morning in the conference room of Grayson and Alder. My attorney, Mr. Grayson, was preparing me for the grand jury. Lorraine. We have to be extremely precise, Mr. Grayson said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. The defense strategy is going to be simple. They will try to paint you as a silent partner. They will argue that you were fully aware of the risky nature of these investments and that you are only crying fraud now because the market turned against him. We cannot give them an inch. I understand, I said. Mark's defense team sent over a proposal this morning, Mr. Grayson said, sliding a thick document across the mahogany table. I looked at it. It was a plea deal offer, but not for prison time. It was an affidavit prepared for my signature. If you sign this, Mr. Grayson explained, his voice devoid of emotion, you are stating that you gave Mark verbal authority to manage your funds and that you simply misunderstood the risk profile. If you sign this, the fraud charges likely drop to civil negligence. He walks away with probation and a hefty fine, most of which will come from your remaining assets. It was the devil's bargain. I could save him. All I had to do was play the part of the foolish, senile old woman who didn't understand finance. I could take the blame, lose a few $1 million, and keep my son out of prison. For a moment, I wavered. I remembered the little boy who used to bring me dandelion bouquets. Then Agent Miller walked in. He looked tired. He placed a new file on the table next to the plea deal. Before you consider that offer, Mrs. Whitfield, you need to see this, Miller said. I opened the file. It was a list of names, 34 of them. These are the new victims we identified from the server seizure, Miller said. Mark didn't just steal from you. He used your name to close these deals. He told these people retired teachers, veterans, widows that his mother, the former compliance executive at Havenstone, was the chief risk officer for his fund. They gave him their money because they trusted you. I felt the blood drain from my face. If I signed that affidavit, if I admitted to being incompetent to save my son, I would be validating his lies. I would be confirming to the world that I had indeed overseen this disaster. I would be the bait that he used to trap 34 innocent people. That evening, I went to the small chapel down the street. I sat in the back pew with Reverend Thomas, a man who had known me for 20 years. I want to save him. Thomas, I whispered. He is my flesh and blood. Forgiveness is a powerful thing. Lorraine, the Reverend said gently, resting his hand on the pew. But you must remember that forgiveness does not mean freedom from consequences. Sometimes, the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child face the wreckage they created. If you shield him now, are you saving his soul? Or just his lifestyle? I went home and sat at my kitchen table. To my left lay the affidavit from Mark's lawyer, the lie that would set him free. To my right lay the witness cooperation agreement from the Department of Justice, the truth that would lock him away. The house was silent. I picked up my pen. My hand trembled, the vibration travelling all the way up my arm to my shoulder. I thought of the couple from Asheville. I thought of the veterans on Miller's list. I thought of the 90% match on the forged signature. I moved the pen to the right. I signed the cooperation agreement. The ink flowed dark and permanent. The next morning, I handed the single sheet of paper to Mr. Grayson. "I will not lie for him," I said, my voice steady. "I will tell the truth. If Mark wants to save himself, he is going to have to start by doing the same." Mr. Grayson nodded once and slipped the paper into his briefcase. The sound of the latch clicking shut echoed like a gavel in the empty room. The plea deal was dead. Now, we were going to trial. The polished granite floors of the federal courthouse in Charlotte felt colder than any winter I had ever known. I had walked into buildings like this 100 times during my career, carrying briefcases full of compliance audits and evidence logs. But today, the briefcase in my hand felt leaden, and the name on the docket was not a stranger's. It was Mark Anthony Whitfield. I walked past the security checkpoint, feeling the eyes of the press on my back. But I did not look down. I kept my head high, just as I had taught my son to do before he decided that looking people in the eye was too difficult when you were lying to them. Inside the courtroom, the air was stale and recycled. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Mrs. Vance, did not waste time with theatrics. She laid out the indictment like a deck of cards, each charge heavier than the last: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, conspiracy to commit financial abuse of the elderly. Mark sat at the defense table, shrinking into his suit. His lawyer, a man with a smile that looked purchased, stood up to paint a portrait of a misunderstood boy. "Your Honor?" the lawyer began, his voice smooth. "Mark Whitfield is a victim here. He was a young entrepreneur dazzled by bad partners, a man who grew up without a father figure, suffocated by a mother who demanded perfection and controlled his every financial move. He did not intend to steal. He was drowning, and he reached for a lifeline. I sat in the gallery, my face a mask of stone, while they blamed my love for his crimes. Then came the first tremors of the earthquake. Mrs. Vance stood up, holding a single sheet of paper. "The defense claims Mr. Whitfield was merely trying to save his business," she said, her voice cutting through the lawyer's fog. "However, we have traced a secondary diversion of funds. Of the attempted $9 million transfer, $500,000 was routed not to business debts, but to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That account is not in the defendant's name. It is registered to Paige Elizabeth Whitfield." A gasp ripped through the quiet room. I turned my head slowly. Paige was sitting 2 rows behind the defense table, dressed in a modest grey suit intended to garner sympathy. Her hands flew to her mouth. She stared at the back of Mark's head, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. I didn't know Paige whispered loudly, panic rising in her throat. I never signed anything for a Cayman account Mark refused to turn around." In that moment, Paige realized she was not his partner. She was his parachute. He had set up the account in her name so that if the ship went down, she would be the one holding the stolen cargo. The look of adoration she usually reserved for him evaporated, replaced by a pure visceral revulsion. During the recess, I was called into a small conference room. Mark was there, flanked by his legal team and Mrs. Vance. It was a proffer session, a last-ditch attempt to see if there was anything left to salvage. Mark looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, but there was no remorse in them, only hate. "We can make this go away." "Mom," he said, his voice raspy. "Just tell them you knew. Just tell them you forgot. Why are you doing this? Because I am the only one who loves you enough to stop you," I said quietly. He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You call this love? You are destroying me." He leaned forward, the shackles on his wrists clinking against the metal table. "Go ahead. Send me away. But know this. You will die alone in that big house with your precious money. No one will hold your hand when you go. You will just be a rich, rotting corpse." The room went deadly silent. His lawyer closed his eyes, knowing his client had just dug his own grave. Mrs. Vance scribbled furiously on her notepad, documenting the lack of remorse. I looked at the boy I had carried for 9 months. I looked at the man who had just wished for my lonely death. "You are wrong. Mark," I said, and my voice did not waver. "My money will go to people who do not use it to destroy other human beings. It will go to people who understand the value of an honest dollar. And as for dying alone, I would rather die alone with my integrity than live surrounded by people who are waiting for me to stop breathing so they can loot my corpse." That night, back in my hotel room, the adrenaline finally faded. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan cutting through the shadows. Sleep was impossible. My mind kept rewinding the tape, searching for the moment the thread had snapped. I saw Mark at 5, handing me a drawing of a house. I saw him at 12, lying about a broken window. I saw him at 22, wearing his graduation gown, smiling that charming smile that hid so much. Had I been too hard? Had I been too soft? Had I bought his love instead of earning it? I got up and walked to the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light was harsh, highlighting every year of my age. I looked at the woman staring back at me. She looked tired. She looked heartbroken. But she did not look weak. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the glass. "Tomorrow, my son loses his freedom, and I lose the last illusion I had about him." I turned off the light. "But at least," I said to the darkness, "no one else will ever lose a cent because of him again." I placed my hand on the Bible and felt the leather cool against my palm. The bailiff asked if I swore to tell the whole truth, and for the first time in my life, the weight of that oath did not feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon. I looked out at the gallery. I saw the victims who had lost their retirement funds because they trusted my name. I saw Paige, staring at the floor, distancing herself from the wreckage. And I saw Mark. He looked small in his expensive suit, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "I do," I said, my voice steady. Mrs. Vance, the prosecutor, walked me through the timeline with surgical precision. We started with the small loans Mark begged for back in college. We moved to the first forged signature on the bridge loan. Then we arrived at the night he tried to drain $9,200,000 from my accounts. She asked me to recount his threat. "He told me that if I did not cooperate," I said, looking directly at the jury, "he would have me declared mentally incompetent. He said he would put me in a state facility so he could manage my assets without interference." Mark's defense attorney tried to rattle me. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, and asked if I had been a controlling mother. He asked if I had used my money as a leash to force Mark into a career he hated. Yes, I answered simply. I pushed him. I wanted him to be successful because I was afraid he would end up like his father. I used money to fix his mistakes because I thought that was what love looked like. I was wrong. The lawyer froze. He had expected a denial. My admission stripped him of his narrative. Then came the silence. Mrs. Vance played a recording recovered from Mark's phone. It was a conversation with his partner, Dalton. Mark's voice filled the courtroom, loud and clear. When the old lady kicks the bucket, I get it all anyway. The recording played. But if she fights me now, I have the paperwork to get guardianship. I will drain the trust and dump her in a home before she even knows what day it is. The courtroom went deadly quiet. I watched the jurors' faces harden. Mark sank lower in his chair, refusing to look at anyone. Agent Miller took the stand next. He pulled up the flow of funds chart. He explained to the court that the $9,200,000 Mark thought he had stolen was never his to keep. The funds were part of a controlled bait account, Miller explained. Every cent was tracked. The defendant never successfully laundered the money. He only succeeded in creating a perfect digital trail of his intent to commit grand larceny. I watched Mark's face as the realization hit him. He had destroyed his life for money that was never real. He had sold his soul for a mirage. Then Paige stood up. She had been granted immunity in exchange for testimony. She did not look at me. She looked at the judge. I wanted the money, she admitted, her voice shaking. I knew about the scheme. But Mark planned it. Mark forged the signatures. Mark contacted the investors. She paused, then took a breath. I am filing for divorce, Your Honor. I cannot be married to a man who would do this to his own mother. Mark looked at her, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. He was completely alone. The judge read the sentence 2 hours later. For wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. Mark Anthony Whitfield was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was ordered to pay full restitution to every victim. As the marshals moved to handcuff him, Mark turned to me. His face was a mask of bitterness. You won, he sneered, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Are you happy now? I looked at him, feeling a profound, aching sadness where my heart used to be. The day I started fighting back was not to win against you, Mark, I said softly. It was to make sure people like you do not win against anyone else ever again. I walked out of the courthouse into the grey afternoon. The air in Charlotte was cold, biting through my coat. I clutched my purse against my side. Inside, there was no money, just the copy of the trust that would go to charities and distant relatives I had yet to meet. I knew that tonight. I would go back to an empty house in Sarasota. I would eat dinner alone. But as I walked down the steps, I realized that the silence waiting for me was no longer terrifying. It was peaceful. I had closed the door on the thief who lived in my heart, and for the first time in years, I was safe. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It was not an easy one to tell, but I believe the truth has to be spoken, even when it hurts. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you want to hear more stories like this, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video reach more people who might need to hear it. Stay safe out there, everyone.